I also mentioned that I'll try to not answer that question, but whatever question I feel like.
And I told him that was okay.
Yeah, that's right. But just in terms of, how do we measure, this is a typical, how do we measure outcomes versus inputs? And just in terms of projects that I've been working on at Moody's, this is a very similar project to the first project that we took on in the impact investment space, which is in the microfinance area, where ultimately what you want to know in microfinance is, are you helping the poor, or are you helping groups that are disadvantaged? And the problem is that you can't really measure, at least the way the economy, the state of the industry is right now, you can't really measure outcomes. So you're forced to measure the inputs and the processes that institutions have in place with the hope that it has the benefit on the outcomes. And that's an imperfect type of situation that you find yourself in, but a necessary one to start out. But as the markets then mature and you start collecting the inputs, and at the same time you start collecting the outcomes, what you'll eventually be able to do is take those two data sets and put them together and see what practices impact your outcomes. Until you can do that, what you need to do is start developing what we refer to as expert systems. Whereas everyone in this room pretty much has a lot of experience with different areas, climate change, social issues, and so on. And rather than trying to have a Moody's or anyone else try to guess as to what the key factors are, what we've done at Moody's is try to develop a way of developing these type of systems where we collect all the different factors and indicators that the markets feel are important in terms of measuring whatever outcomes that we're going to look at. And then by using a modeling system, we actually then model those inputs to put weights to them. We effectively develop a scorecard that will weight all the inputs to the different processes. The advantage of doing that, as opposed to the way I see most of these systems are developed, is that most of the time you'll get a small group together, you'll put them in a room, and people will argue, and whoever comes out alive at the end gets their way as to what the most important inputs are. The problem is you come up with one number at the end with very little information around that number as to why you actually came up with that number. By using a modeling system, what you actually do is you find a range of different answers as to what different stakeholders felt were important. You can actually see how much agreement or disagreement there are on different factors. So you can take the mean, which we look at as kind of the industry average of what people feel are important, but you can also see the range around that. You can do a lot more research in that. And there are also data checks on the information that you get in terms of how consistently someone's answering certain questions, so you know if they have an idea of what of the markets and the types of questions that you're asking. So again, this is an imperfect way to do it, but it's actually a starting point that can at least give you all the inputs with some weighting, and then at the same time you start measuring the outcomes, and you have to have pretty good indicators of the outcomes. So for climate change, carbon emissions or carbon equivalent, you might want to look at that. For other aspects, it may not be so clear, for hunger indices and so on, and those outcomes. And then at some point when you get enough data, you can regress those two together and start coming up with a mixed system, which it would be a quantitative and a qualitative system, and where I think you eventually need to be. But until we can do that, I think we're just really stuck with the expert system. But having said that, I think we need to approach this expert system in a more methodical way than we traditionally have done in the past.
Marisa, Mackey is the Associate Director of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And let's just dig a little more into that, Marisa. I mean, how do we really know what is important to measure? I mean, what is material? You've worked in different industries. Maybe you could tell us your the stories of some of those industries as well as how you guys go about it.
Definitely. So the role of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is to develop accounting standards by which companies would disclose their environmental, social, and governance performance in the Form 10K and 20F. So this is a form of integrated reporting. In terms of what's material, we're using the U.S. Supreme Court definition of materiality. So what's I find great about SASB is we're working within the existing regulatory framework in the U.S. as opposed to needing regulatory change for these standards to be required disclosure. So under existing U.S. securities laws, if something is material, i.e. it's going to change the reasonable investor's buy, hold, or sell decision, then de facto this is required disclosure in the 10K. So what our approach has been is, and Jody, to your point as well, we're taking what we like to call an evidence-based approach that starts with our research process. So we have a growing group of researchers dedicated to identifying what are the material issues on an industry-by-industry basis. And we're going to cover 80 industries. So far, we've gone through the healthcare sector, technology, and financials, and now we're working on non-renewables. But looking at, what are stakeholder concerns, but also for disclosure in the 10K, what is the evidence of financial impact on a company? So really, we're identifying that intersection of sustainability issues and business value creation. The other item to that is that, once our research team has gone through and identified what we believe are the material issues in an industry or sector, we do convene industry working groups of experts. But these are very large groups. So for instance, our financials working groups had about 300 participants from the financials industry. So we're getting a really broad array of input, and we really look for balance between the investor perspective, the corporate perspective, and then also what we call intermediaries. So I think, Jody, to your point, kind of circumventing that traditional expert system, I think you referred to it, and taking a more systematic approach to identifying those issues. You also asked about some of the specific sectors, but I don't want to take up all the time.
We'll come back to some of the sectors, I think, and let's just go to Aldo Bonati, who's with us from Milan, from ECPI, and you work with ratings directly for helping investors make decisions. And I'm sort of wondering whether you can tell us sort of what is the signaling value of ESG reporting? Does it indicate, sort of long-term outperformance, as some people have argued? I think you might have a different take on that.
Well, definitely, there are different opinions on this. A study published by Nomura equity research team in May, and based on a sample of almost 2,000 world companies for the period spanning from 2005 to March 2013, found that ESG rating downgrade matters. As companies experiencing an ESG rating downgrade were more exposed to the risk of a decline in their share price than the other companies in the peer group. And the report found also two other interesting things. One is that the dimension of the downgrade matters. And the second is that the nature of the downgrade matters. The dimension of the downgrade matters in as much as within the peer group of companies experiencing a rating downgrade, those experiencing a multiple notch downgrade, so a downgrade of 2 or more notches, so their share price declining more than the other companies in the peer group, so companies with a single notch downgrade. The nature of the rating matters, as also within the peer group of companies with a multiple notch downgrade, those that were downgraded because of their environmental dimension performed